So our story today comes from the book of Joshua. And I'm going to tell it with a big bunch of grapes. But I want you to know that some of these grapes kind of look like balloons, right? They may make a lot of noise. You know how balloons pop. So don't be afraid. Don't be surprised if you hear some popping noises. Our lesson, remember, comes from the book of Joshua. And it's the story of the people of Israel before they go into the land of Canaan, or the promised land. You guys, last Sunday, Miss Allison gave you a lesson about the promised land and Joshua and the brave soldiers taking over the land of Canaan with the sun standing still so that they would have a full day to fight, a longer day to fight. God created that miracle for them. This takes place right before that, so we're going a little bit backwards, but I just love this story and I wanted you to hear it, and I felt like you needed to hear how God wants us to be brave and to be faithful to Him. Okay, so here goes our story. Moses, you see that? Moses was the leader of the Israelites. You all know that. God had helped Moses lead the people out of slavery and captivity in Israel, or in Egypt. They went through the wilderness and went toward the promised land, the land that God had promised to Abraham and then to his descendants, that they would be able to live there for always. That was the promised land, and that's where Moses was the leader and was taking the people. The promised land was in a land called Canaan, and there were already people living there. It had been 400 years since the Israelites, or Abraham's descendants, a small group of Israelites, had moved down to Egypt to avoid the famine. Remember the story of Joseph? That had happened about 400 years before, when Israel was really just a family of 12 sons and all their wives and children. A big family, but a pretty small nation. Now they've been in captivity in Egypt for 400 years, and there are a lot of them, hundreds of thousands of people, and they're ready to move back into that land that God had promised them, but other people had moved in. So this land of Canaan is beautiful land. It's hilly country, beautiful, fertile land where lots of things grow, and it was called the land of milk and honey because it was so rich with food and with flowers and plants. It was going to be wonderful because these people had been wandering in the desert for so long. They were very excited to go to a land that sounded like a land of milk and honey. They were looking forward to going to the promised land. So before they could go into the land of the promised land, God told Moses, I want you to get together 12 spies, 12 brave, strong young men, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and send them into the land to explore. I want them to see the land and then come back and tell the people, so the people will be excited about going into this strange new land. So that's what they did. God told Moses to choose 12 spies, and he did. Those spies are named in verse 13, chapter 13, verses 3 through 6. So you can look that up. In chapter 13, verses 3 through 6 are the names of all of the spies and all of the tribes that they came from. Their job was to go into the land, and go into this land of milk and honey and see what was there. Moses gave them some things to look for. Moses gave them some questions, and you can find those in chapter 13, verses 17 through 20. Moses had some questions about the land. He wanted to know, what does the land look like? How is the soil? Do crops grow there? What kind of foods and crops are there? What kind of people live there? Do they have big, strong cities or little wimpy, dinky cities? All of those questions are there in chapter 13, and they are what the spies were going to find out. For 40 days, the spies went into the land. They had to go over a desert, over some hills, and then they went into the land of Canaan. And they looked around and they gathered information and they looked at all the cities, and they were kind of sneaky. They must have been very brave. I would have been scared to be sneaking around in a land where the people are sort of their enemies, but they weren't. They were so brave, and they brought back fruit and vegetables to show the people how rich the land was. They brought back a bunch of grapes that was so big it took 2 men to carry it. Kind of imagine that it was like this, just a really big bunch of grapes. And they brought pomegranates and figs, all kinds of things. Now remember, these people have been living in the desert for quite a while. They were excited. They were going to be excited to see this fruit. Then they carried their big sample of grapes. Remember, it took 2 people to carry them. They had it on a stick, and they carried this big bunch of grapes back to Moses and Aaron and all of the people. They had a big meeting with all of the people of Israel and Moses and Aaron, and they said, "It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. It's beautiful. The grass is green and the crops are great. It's a beautiful land." Now, when they say it was a land flowing with milk and honey, does that mean that it had creeks and rivers that had milk in them and honey in it? No, that would be kind of gross. What it means, it's a exaggeration. It's an exaggeration. They're saying it is so wonderful. There's so many fruits and vegetables and trees that the bees are making all kinds of honey. It's just flowing with honey. And there's so many cows and sheep and goats that the milk just flows. There's plenty for us to eat. That was the key. They were coming back to say that there was a lot. There was an abundance. It was a beautiful land, and it was the place they should go. But 10 of the spies then said, "But the people there are giants. They are so big. They are so strong that they make us look like little bitty grasshoppers. There's no way we can overtake these people." Now that's fear talking. When fear gets in our minds, we start talking kind of crazy talk. And they were saying that these people were giants. They weren't giants. There's no such thing as giants. They were big and strong, yeah, because they lived in a beautiful, fertile land and they had lots of good food and they were strong, healthy people. They were not giants, and they did not make the Israelites look this big like a grasshopper. Fear was talking, and fear is a liar. However, Joshua and Caleb did not speak out of fear. Joshua and Caleb spoke out of faith. They said, "Yes, indeed, it is a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. And yes, there are a lot of people there and they have some strong fortified cities. But we can take this land, and we should take this land. God will give us this land. If we follow God and obey Him, He will give us this land. We should do this." Well, the people were furious. They did not like that idea at all. They said that Joshua and Caleb should be killed for saying that they should go and take this land. They were crazy because the fear overtook them, and they started acting crazy. They cried out and they ripped their clothes, and they wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb to death, throw rocks at them until they died because they were so afraid. Fear makes people do really stupid things, and that's what they were wanting to do. They wouldn't listen to the voice of faith that Joshua and Caleb had. God was so disappointed in the people because they were afraid and because they wouldn't listen to what He had promised them. He had promised them. It was called the Promised Land. And they wouldn't listen to Him. And He said, "I've had it with you people. You're not going to enter this promised land. I'm not going to let you." Anyone who is an adult right now, 20 years and older, will die before it's time to go into the promised land. That didn't mean they were going to die right immediately, but they were going to die of sickness and old age. He was not going to let them go into the promised land. Only the people who were kids at that time, when they grew up, 40 years later, they were going to get to go into the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb. Yes, they were adults, but God said Joshua and Caleb and their families, because of their faith, they will also live long enough to enter into this beautiful promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. But the rest of you adults who acted like crazy people and tried to stone Joshua and Caleb, and who said you couldn't go into the land of milk and honey, you're not going in. So sad. Those people even said that it would be better if we went back to Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt instead of trying to go into this promised land. Egypt? Seriously? Egypt is where they were slaves. Egypt is where Pharaoh killed their firstborn children. But that's how fearful these people were of the giants in the land and of the fortified cities. They would rather run back to Egypt and be slaves than to follow God. But that's not what Joshua and Caleb wanted to do. Joshua and Caleb had faith, and they said, we can take this land and we will. So 40 years passed. People grew old, got sick and died, as people do over time. 40 years is a long time. And finally, all the people that were kids when Joshua and Caleb had gone to be the spies originally, those people were now grown-ups. They were, in their 40s, 50s, and they were old enough to go into the land, and God let them go into the beautiful promised land that He had promised them so many years ago, and that He wanted them to be in. God wants His faithful people who love Him to be in His promised land and to be with Him. And that's what He did. He brought them into the promised land. You heard one of the stories last week of how Joshua and the soldiers fought a battle to take over one of the areas of that land. There were lots of stories and lots of battles. You guys know the story of Jericho, where they marched around the city. That's part of taking over the promised land. That's what God helped the people do, because they weren't afraid, and they had faith, and they believed in God. Remember our memory verse? It says, the Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. That's what we need to remember. This is a very important verse to learn, to memorize, and to hide it in your heart. While it seems that there's a lot to be afraid of around us right now, tornadoes, viruses, no school, we know God is with us, and He will never, ever leave us. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you soon.